Okay, should I start? Janaina?
Si puede empezar, Edgardo.
Okay. Well, first I want to welcome you. My name is Edgardo Landera. I'm from Venezuela. I'm a TNI fellow. I work with Global Dialogue. And we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the first of 3 webinars organized by the Global Dialogue for Systemic Change that we have called The Emperor's New Clothes, that will explore the United States and US imperialism after Trump. The United States today presents one of the most dynamic political systems in the world, with intense confrontations between the right-wing and extreme right-wing tendencies represented by Trump and the Republican Party on one hand, and vigorous popular movements, especially those dealing with racism, like Black Lives Matter, feminist movements, movements in defense of migrants, and environmental justice movements. With the expansion of its progressive caucus in Congress, the Democratic Party as a whole has shifted towards more progressive positions, but its right wing continues to have significant influence and has been able to block some of the central demands of movements and the party left, like putting an end to filibuster and the protection and expansion of voting rights. There are, as we will see in today's presentations, significant divisions within the ruling class. In this seminars, we will explore with our guests some of the internal and foreign policy displacements currently occurring in the United States. What are the continuities? What are the changes from Trump to the Biden government? These seminars will be taking place in a particular critical historical moment. The withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan has led to widespread interpretations about the current state of US hegemony in the world. The end of US hegemony, the end of US imperialism, or just some passing occurrence. Some of these issues will be dealt with today. The second webinar on September 9th will deal with China-US relations and the possibilities of an emerging new Cold War. The third webinar, September the 16th, will explore the impacts of these displacements in Latin America. Today we'll have 2 presentations, one by Ashley Smith and the second one by Phyllis Perez. Our first speaker, Ashley, is a socialist writer and activist. He is the managing director of the Marxist Spectre Journal and a member of Champlain Valley Democratic Socialists of America and Community Voices for immigrant rights. We will talk about what he calls Biden's Imperialist Keynesian project. Second speaker, Phyllis, is an activist, author, and political commentator dealing mainly with issues of war and peace, the United Nations, the Middle East, and Palestinian rights, as well as civil rights movements within the United States. She will be talking about Afghanistan withdrawal in the context of the lack of coherence and divisions within the US ruling class, about shift in military strategic planning under the Biden administration, how that may influence foreign policy more broadly, and about the rising social movements in the United States. She will also discuss the threat posed to progressive movements, to people of color, to immigrants, and others by white supremacist movements with significant support among powerful ruling class sectors. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes. Then we'll open the floor for comments and questions by a limited number of pre-registered participants. Please ask for the floor by using the Zoom raise hand function accessed by clicking the participant's tab. There is a 3-minute limit for each of these interventions. The other participants will be able to post questions and comments on the Zoom chat. We will dedicate 30 minutes to this part of the webinar. Finally, the two panelists will have time to respond to comments and questions. We have interpreters that will translate into French, Spanish, English, and Portuguese. Please select your preferred language. So let's start with our first panelist. Ashley, you have the floor. 20 minutes.
Thank you, Edgardo. And thanks to all the other organizers, and most importantly to the interpreters, so we can have this wonderful international audience. I think we meet today and amidst the Biden administration really beginning to carry out a major reorientation of US state strategy. However shambolic and catastrophic, Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan is part of that reorientation of the US state project. He's trying to reprioritize US policy away from the so-called war on terror toward great power competition with China. To do that, he has to address many of the systemic crises that plague US capitalism and have led to its relative decline as an imperial power against other states in the world system, most importantly, China. Biden's new strategy is what I call Imperialist Keynesianism. Its basic aim is to refurbish the profitability and growth of US capitalism and enable the US state to maintain its dominant position as the world hegemon and beat back the challenge it faces from China. This reorientation has been forced on the US and its intelligent sectors of the American capitalist class by 4 systemic crises. The first and most important is the low profitability of US capitalism. Washington's neoliberal response to the Great Recession has failed to restore profit rates and significant new growth to the US economy. It hasn't triggered a new boom over the last 10 years. Its bailout after the Great Recession of corporations, its tax cut for the rich, and austerity measures imposed on workers and oppressed people have not raised profit rates and have not triggered a new boom, a new expansion of the economy. In fact, all those measures kept alive the problems that plague US capitalism. The so-called zombie corporations are one example of that. That is, corporations that can't even pay their own debts without taking out more loans. So they're essentially unprofitable corporations that comprise about 20% of US capital right now. And instead of the profitable companies investing in new projects, new plant and machinery in the real economy, they've instead invested in the stock market to drive up their stocks and to pad their own wealth. But that's not real investment. That's fictitious capital, and it's benefited them, but hasn't provoked real growth in the US economy. So the US remains trapped in what Michael Roberts calls a long depression, or David McNally calls a global slump of low profitability, low growth rates, and vacillations between weak recoveries and serious recessions. This problem of US capitalism has led to its relative decline as an imperial power against other capitalist states, most importantly, China. The US had tried to shore up its standing as the world's unrivaled hegemon through its so-called war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, but instead of securing its unrivaled dominance, those military interventions and occupations and the defeats it suffered have accelerated its relative decline and opened up greater space for rivals, both regional and international, to emerge, most importantly, China. And the inter-imperial rivalry between the US, China, and other states and the capitalist priorities of all those states have basically blocked any real solution to the third great crisis of the system, and that is climate change. And so we've witnessed this year just endless storms, fires, rising sea levels, the swamping of New York City last night by Hurricane Ida in its weakened form as a storm. In other words, climate crisis continues. So that's the third big crisis plaguing the US system and indeed the whole global system. Finally, the pandemic, which itself is a product of capitalist globalization, has also triggered one of the sharpest recessions in the world economy over the last year that we've ever witnessed. So those are the big four crises that US capitalism and much of the world faces. These great crises have intensified class, social, and political polarization in the United States to a degree that I don't know if it's got parallels in American history. 4 decades of neoliberalism have generated the greatest class divisions since the robber baron era of the late 19th century and early 20th century. These have driven deep political polarization and unrest. We've seen waves of struggle since the Great Recession, from the Occupy movement to Black Lives Matter to the Red State Teachers revolts, all sorts of resistance by immigrants under the Trump administration and under the Obama administration, many social movements. And those social movements and class struggles have fueled the development of a new socialist left in the United States. Most importantly, the growth of the Democratic Socialists of America, which now numbers about 100,000 people. It's the largest socialist organization really since the Socialist Party in the United States. So you've had tremendous polarization to the left, but you've also seen tremendous polarization to the right, because the inequalities, instability, and crises also radicalize non-progressive elements in society, especially the new middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie, the small shopkeepers, and those have become the shock troops for the rise of a new right expressed in Donald Trump inside the Republican Party, but also in the emergence of fascist street thugs in the streets of the United States. This political polarization broke into US electoral politics with the election of Donald Trump as president, and his 4 years of racist nationalist rule only exacerbated all of US capitalism's and US imperialism's problems. He broke with the US strategy of superintending global capitalism for America First nationalism, which had reactionary domestic impact in terms of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, racist policies domestically, but also a kind of new nationalist policy internationally that created a transactional relationship with all the states in the world system, whether they be opponents or allies of the United States. And the pandemic, which Trump oversaw and did little to stop, ravaged US society and polarized it even more. Trump's rule triggered an even more intense wave of struggle, most dramatically the Black Lives Matter uprising of the summer of 2020, when literally the streets of the United States were filled with demonstrations of a mass character, whose numbers number about 26 million people participated in the social uprising for Black lives. Really an unprecedented wave of protest in the United States. So the instabilities foisted on US society by Trump's break with the traditional strategies posed a predicament for the US capitalist class, its state managers, its bureaucrats in the US state, as well as to the political class that controls the two capitalist parties, the Democrats and Republicans, to search for a new strategy to replace the failing neoliberal strategy of accumulation. The Republican Party, frankly, is mostly brain dead and has very few ideas and is dominated by its Trump wing right now. And they have really no solution to the problems that I outlined, America's 3 great crises. The real thinking has been concentrated in the establishment of the Democratic Party. All of them recognize the relative decline of the US imperialism against China. And they all recognize that the neoliberal regime of accumulation has been failing to restore the profits and growth of US capitalism. And that has led to a wave of articles in the run-up to Biden's election, where establishment thinkers in journals like Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and in the pages of the main newspapers of American capitalism, like the New York Times, really began to grapple with the problems that the US ruling classes faces in its domestic and international projects. And I think the Democratic Party is where this has all gotten expressed in a rational fashion. And it has come up with, through the Biden administration, through Biden's election in the last presidential election, with a strategy that I call Imperialist Keynesianism, which is really a first iteration of an attempt to come up with a new regime of accumulation to overcome US capitalism's problems and restore US power in the world system. Biden has tried to implement it in his first few months in office. His aim is to ameliorate domestic inequality, revive US capitalism, and restore US power as an unrivaled global hegemon. Biden's moved quickly to roll out vaccinations to deal with the pandemic, to bring it under control. Of course, he hoarded vaccines, putting America first, as you would predict. And his goal was really to get the US economy up and running again, because it had been knocked back off its feet by the pandemic. And that has, in initial phases, was quite successful and got the US economy roaring back to between 6 and 7% growth over the deep recession the pandemic caused. The second thing he did was break with the neoliberal strategy that the Obama administration used after the Great Recession to come up with a new Keynesian strategy to revive the economy. So the first thing he did was roll out the $2 trillion American Rescue Package, which of course bailed out corporations, but unlike Obama, invested intensely in working class people and supporting the lives and livelihood of working class and oppressed people in US society. And the goal of that was to spur consumption and get the economy going again. Like the pandemic vaccination, the American Rescue Plan has triggered a recovery. And the next phase of the Keynesian project that Biden is implementing is his giant infrastructure spending, which is coming in two parts: about $1 trillion for material infrastructure spending, which is in the works, which would build roads and bridges and rebuild the dilapidated infrastructure, which has been wrecked really by 4 decades of neoliberalism. And the second phase of that will be the $3.5 trillion for social welfare spending, which is going to be an enormous project, and that is in process right now inside the reconciliation bill, working its way through the US Congress. And he wants to pay for this enormous new Keynesian stimulus and social welfare spending by taxing the rich and corporations in a relatively modest fashion. And Biden's goal in doing all this is to restore growth and profitability, and thereby the strength of US capitalism vis-a-vis China. As he makes repeatedly clear, all his social domestic spending is tied to increasing the competitiveness of the US economy and state with China. None of this, therefore, should be seen as social democratic, nor even as robust as the New Deal liberalism that we saw in the United States under Roosevelt in the 1930s. It's a very limited program. It pales in comparison to the New Deal as a percentage of the US economy. And that spending is really quite small when you consider that it's spread out over 8 years when it is going to be implemented. At best, the social welfare spending will bring the US up to the levels of neoliberal Europe, and it will not build the kind of robust social welfare structures that we all, I think, in the United States on the left want. And the proposed tax increases are actually quite modest and will do little to really redistribute the wealth in US society on the scale that we desperately need. Nevertheless, Biden is using this program to achieve several domestic and international goals. Domestically, he hopes to dampen the political polarization that has swept US society. He hopes to co-opt the left and demobilize struggle, and most importantly for him, neutralize the threat from the Republican right, which I think the Biden administration, the Democratic Party, see as a real threat to the US imperial project. So those are his domestic aims. The other big one is, of course, what I've emphasized, which is restoring the profitability and capacity of US capital. And if you look at what Biden says about his investment in the US economy, it's all about China. He repeatedly says it in all of his policy statements. And that's the third major item, obviously, is the competition with China. To carry all of this out, he has to reorient in a way that Phyllis will talk about the US political priorities in the world system away from the war on terror towards great power competition with China, Russia, regional powers like Iran, et cetera. Now, the question is, will this project work? Keynesianism, I don't think, will overcome the low profitability and low growth of US capitalism. At best, it will trigger what Michael Roberts calls a sugar rush of growth in the US economy, followed by a sugar crash of the US economy and a return to the patterns of sluggish growth that have plagued US capitalism since the Great Recession. On the pandemic, the Biden administration's rush to reopen the economy was a big mistake. And now the Delta variant is hammering the US society. And it's exacerbated by the continued stranglehold that the Republican Party has over several states and from their positions of power, they've refused to impose vaccine mandates, mask mandates, and have reopened things in a reckless fashion. And that has triggered the huge epidemic of the Delta variant throughout the country, which is putting in jeopardy the strength of the economic recovery. And his policies will do little to really redress the climate crisis, which in some ways his infrastructure spending in roads and bridges will exacerbate, and is certainly his continued service of the natural gas and oil economy will continue those problems. We'll see if it's able to restore the competitiveness of the United States against China. Certainly, I think the Afghanistan debacle, which is a debacle and defeat for US imperialism, will be a setback in that project. But I think it's too early to tell how successful he will be able to extract himself from that crisis to reorient the US on great power competition with China, because the unintended consequences of the shambolic withdrawal could trigger all sorts of blowback that bog the US down in an unending set of drone strikes, special ops, which will take them away from their main priority, which is competition with China. And I'll just conclude by talking about what Biden means for the socialist left, the new socialist movement that has emerged. I think there's a real danger for the socialist movement in the US that it becomes co-opted as an appendage to the Biden administration and its capitalist agenda of liberal reform. And there are certain elements inside the socialist movement that are backing Biden in a full-throated fashion. Bernie Sanders, for example, who galvanized all sorts of elements of the socialist left, is now campaigning for the passage of Biden's program. And the danger is that instead of retaining our independence from Biden, we'll get co-opted and become an appendage to get what we can through the Biden administration and accept the limits of his capitalist liberalism as the only realistic things that we can get. Now, I think we should reject any kind of ultra-left dismissal of the reforms that Biden is enacting. Some of them will definitely benefit working class and oppressed people, and we should argue not only in favor of them, but we should argue for their radical expansion, because they pale in comparison to the needed level of reform that we need in US society to redress the systemic inequalities that plague the country. But I think we need to stick to our demands at the same time for much more radical reforms like Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, defunding the police, ending the US occupations and military bases all throughout the world, and the US paying reparations to the countries it destroyed in the war on terror and many other occupations. And most importantly, I think we have to re-emphasize the importance of independent mass struggle, like the Black Lives Matter movement, like Occupy, like the Red State Teachers Revolt, which put the agenda of social reform and radical change into the public discussion and enabled the rise of the new socialist movement. So we have to stick to our focus on those struggles and not become dominated by just electoral politics and getting the best we can get in the confines of the Democratic Party. And most importantly, I think we have to stick to our goal of trying to build some kind of independent socialist alternative to both capitalist parties, the Republicans who are controlled by right-wing lunatics, and the Democratic Party who's got a sane capitalist agenda that services their interests, not ours. It's time for us to build a genuine socialist alternative.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Sure, there will be a lot of questions and comments. And thanks for keeping within the time limit. Now, Phyllis.
Well, thanks, Edgardo, and thanks, Ashley. Thank you all from the Global Dialogue and those of you on the call, and especially to the interpreters who always work harder than the rest of us on these calls. I'm going to start by doing something I never do, which is to discuss the crisis around the Afghanistan situation, the Afghanistan war, the Afghanistan withdrawal, from the vantage point not of Afghans, but from the vantage point of the US. I don't like to do that for all the reasons you can imagine. But in this context, the discussion is actually about the US, and I'm simply using the US process in Afghanistan as one of the examples that we're seeing. The Afghanistan war was never a war that imperialism needed. It didn't need to happen from their vantage point. There was no strategic interest of US imperialism, of the US empire, to go to war against Afghanistan. The neoconservatives who were in power at the time saw it as an opportunity, both to focus on vengeance for the attacks of September 11th, 2001, and most importantly, to prepare the American people to prepare them ideologically, if you will, for a much more important war, which would be launched 2 years later against Iraq. So it was, in a sense, a derivative war. And it reflects, in that sense, the kind of unevenness that exists in the US between military power as projected in the world and all of the other kinds of power that it has historically used to project around the world, those being diplomatic, economic, political influence. Military influence has always been the strongest of all the instruments of US capital, of the US ruling class. And so they rely on the military. And one of the components of that is that money goes massively disproportionately to military spending, far more than it goes to spending on diplomacy, for instance, or even some of the economic institutions that would expand US power globally. And that focus on the military is something that is shared quite widely across all mainstream ruling class circles. So on the ideological side, the neoconservative commitment that had emerged as a commitment to regime change, for global dominance, military, political, economic global dominance, would be realized through the expansion of military force. And with the Cold War being over, the absence of a clear global enemy to justify that kind of military use, military spending, it meant that the so-called global war on terror, as George Bush called it, became a very convenient way, starting with Afghanistan, to rebuild a US consensus that war was the legitimate use of US power and that the US should be the extreme global hegemon. So in that context, you had 88% of the American people at the time of the Afghan war who supported going to war, despite the fact that it was illegal for all those reasons. But 88% of people who were largely paralyzed politically after the the attacks on the Twin Towers, there was a massive level of engagement with this project of going to war. Compare that 20 years later, and I'll get at the end to talk some about our movements that have made part of why that's been made possible. 74% of the American people now say that the war in Afghanistan was never worth it, that all troops should be withdrawn. It's been almost a complete reversal of that public stance. But the attacks of 9/11 provided the political justification that was required, and the way it was put forward as something about justice. It wasn't called vengeance; it was called justice. It was put forward in such an extreme way, that there was virtually no opposition from any other wings of the ruling class who had been opposing quite vigorously the ideological drive of the neoconservatives in terms of their extreme foreign policy. So the real reasons for it, that, as I say, had to do with vengeance, and particularly with the preparation of the people here for war in Iraq, really didn't even bother with the significant value that Afghanistan under US domination might have. There were issues of oil pipelines. Afghanistan doesn't have oil of its own, but it's in an important location in terms of pipelines. There's mining, but there was still no real strategic necessity. It was this derivative war, and therefore, with a very quick overthrow of the Taliban government, there was an immediate shift to this project of so-called nation building based on these claims about bringing democracy, most especially the claim of liberating the women of Afghanistan through air bombing, through a foreign occupation, as if that could actually liberate women, the creation of new school systems, etc. All of that was seen as a very popular justification for this war. And so when Obama, for example, was campaigning on the basis of his opposition to the war in Iraq, he was very explicit in saying, I'm against dumb wars. I'm against stupid wars. Afghanistan for him was a good war. And so you had this extreme position that he took when he first came into office. He said, we have to figure out a better strategy on Afghanistan. We don't quite know what we're doing. So first, we're going to send 17,000 new troops, and then we'll spend a few months figuring out what we're going to do. After those few months, he sent another 30,000 troops. So within the first 10 months of his administration, this supposedly anti-war president had sent 47,000 new troops to Afghanistan. The decision by the Biden administration to end the war was largely politically driven. This was at a moment when now 74% of the public is demanding an end to the war. And Biden had, by the time he came in as vice president under Obama, he had actually opposed the Obama level of escalation. He didn't oppose all escalation. He just thought it should be quite small, not the massive escalation that Obama put in place. So even there, within the mainstream centrist to right sector of the Democratic Party, there was already a division. The other part of his assessment, of course, was the lack of the value to US interests to maintain the war in Afghanistan in what he sees as this new era of what they call near peer competition, which means the military component of competition, particularly with China. Now, of course, the war in Afghanistan was costing about $20 billion a year in these last couple of years. Now, that's a huge amount of money, but it's a tiny, tiny percentage of military spending in the US, which this year was $746 billion. It's an incomprehensible number. 20 billion was only a tiny piece of that. And that 20 billion actually represents half the entire budget for diplomacy and international aid of the United States. That entire budget of the State Department and USAID combined is $40 billion. So half of it was being spent on Afghanistan, but that was not given as a reason. That was not the reason anyone in positions of power had for ending the war in Afghanistan. So it was primarily an internal issue. But it took into account that the ending was going to have to be fast. It was organized, as you all have seen now, without any clear strategy in a very damaging way that has led to massive destruction in Afghanistan, a huge brain drain of more than 125,000 of, including the most educated Afghans, who are the ones who have fled. It also, and I'm not going to get into this in detail, but just to mention that it took place in the context of the nature of the wars of the so-called global war on terror. These wars have overwhelmingly been fought in Muslim majority countries against forces identified as some version of Islamist forces. And that's not an accident. It's not because Islamophobia was somehow the goal of these wars. Islamophobia, particularly as practiced domestically, became a very important tool in building support for the wars. But the reality of those wars partly has to do with location, oil, all the usual issues that we know of why the US went to war in Iraq, for military bases, for the expansion of power, for oil, etc. But also there are origins in the failures of other anti-imperialist movements over the last century. So the failures largely of Arab socialism, the failures of Arab nationalism, the failures of Pan-Arabism, the failures of Arab neoliberalism to answer the challenges of Arab governments, of Arab populations, their problems with their own governments, led to wider opposition, not only to their own governments, but to the imperial forces that supported those governments. And that's what set the stage. Afghanistan, of course, is not an Arab country, but it has the same phenomenon that was at work for the last 40 years. And I'm not going to get into that, but that is something that we have to keep in mind. It's a very different form than the kind of anti-imperialist struggles that we saw in the post-World War II period up until the end of the 20th century. So we talk a lot here, the media is very obsessed with the parallels with Vietnam, particularly the optics, the vision of people being helicoptered off the roof of the US embassy in Saigon, paralleling the helicopter travel out of the embassy in Kabul. But the reality is the consequences of ending this war in Afghanistan was nothing close to liberation. There's no celebration going on, not inside Afghanistan, not here among people who fought against that war for 20 years and finally saw that war ending as we had been demanding for all those years. It was not a victory. This was not liberation for people in Afghanistan. So we have to understand the nuances of it in that way. The key lessons of the war in Vietnam certainly have not been recognized. The inevitable failure of that war was never acknowledged. The cost of it is really quite extraordinary. The cost of the wars, particularly the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 20 years, has been over $6 trillion. Again, an incomprehensible amount of money. But again, only less than a third of the actual amount, which is about $21 trillion, that has been spent on militarism, including those wars, the $6 trillion there, but another $15 trillion that is the other costs of militarization of the US economy in that period, which includes what's known as the Department of Homeland Security, immigration enforcement, federal support for police, militarization of the borders, all of those components of militarism that are not part of the actual war spending, but represent this enormous component of the US economy. It was very significant in his speech justifying the withdrawal of troops that Biden spoke directly about the cost of the war. He used the figure of $2 trillion, which is a somewhat disputed figure among some of the more right-wing analysts. And he broke it down to the $300 million a day for 20 years that this war has cost. And people now know where that stands relative to the costs of infrastructure, the cost of a Green New Deal, the costs of a real job program, all of that. And so in that context, it was very important that he was acknowledging that those trillions of dollars had been wasted. So as we heard from Ashley, the US ruling class, the US elite, has been facing years of unaccountable presidents in different ways, particularly, of course, Trump's version of America Firstism, his version of nationalism, was in many ways not even traditional nationalism in the sense of making sure of the primacy of the US economy over all other economies. It was much narrower than that. His accountability was not even to the US economy, to US capitalism. It was a narrow economy to his own wealth and power. And so at times his decisions really flew in the face of mainstream and right-wing economic and social and military proposals. In the context of the Biden decision now, that his claim that ending the war in Afghanistan also means ending this era of nation building, which of course means regime change, the neoconservative goal on a global level. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like, because while it's clear that the sole superpower, as it has been for so long, is now dealing with other centers of power that are competing on a peer level, particularly, of course, China, but Russia as well on a military level. But we also know that the global war on terror is not over. It won't end, even if we don't see the continuation by drones and other forces in Afghanistan. We are already still seeing that war being fought in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in so many other parts of the world, in the Sahel, in Somalia, in the Philippines, and elsewhere. So I think what we're likely to see on the foreign policy side is a shift towards something closer to the Chinese style of economic assistance that is based on China's interests, with no illusions about this being in support of democracy or human rights. We'll hear talk about that, I suppose. We'll hear that raised publicly, but that will not play any role, even less than it has in recent years, in determination of how US alliances are built. I think we will probably see less focus on building up the regional allied alliances in places like Israel, India, Egypt. Israel will remain the exception, as it has in so many ways, as a regional power. But we're dealing, coming back to the US side, we're dealing with a reality of enormous economic and social divide in the US population. Ashley went through some of this, and so I won't repeat what he said. But we have in the United States right now 140 million people who are living either below the poverty line or just at the poverty line, which means that one small accident, a car accident, a kid falling out of a tree and breaking an arm, is enough to ruin the life of a family. Somebody has to, well, I won't go through all the details, you can imagine how that works, but it's 140 million poor and low wealth people, half of whom are children, in the wealthiest country in history. So that has led to the kind of divide that we see not only between the ultra rich, the billionaires, and the wealthy, which is an increasingly large gap, but overwhelmingly between the vast majority of the poor, the working poor, and the lower echelons of the middle class against this even moderately wealthy component. The movements that have emerged out of that, as we heard, are not only from the left, but also from the right. On the question of this move away from the privatization component of neoliberalism and the small government component of neoliberalism, I think that it actually, I would maybe differ with Ashley a bit. I think that the social welfare components of these new bills that are pending right now, the $3.5 trillion bill, is massively important. And what's different than the New Deal, it's not as big of a component of the US economy, that's true, but it is much bigger in the sense of who it will benefit. The New Deal excluded large components of the working class based on race. So it excluded domestic workers who were overwhelmingly Black women. It excluded agricultural workers who were overwhelmingly Latino men and women. It excluded whole sectors of the working class that simply were not given access to those benefits. The power of these movements recently has made that impossible, so that those who will benefit from this is a much wider range of the poor and middle class in the United States. It's also given rise to very important movements which don't define themselves either as socialist or even explicitly as part of the left, although functionally, clearly, they are part of the left. One of the most important is the Poor People's Campaign, which is a faith-based mobilization led by an extraordinary African-American minister and a white minister, who the two of them are the partner co-chairs of it. And their leadership has been quite extraordinary in creating a really massive mobilization, largely faith-based, largely not defining itself in the context of either the Black Lives Matter movement itself or the socialist left, but influencing millions of people across the country. The movements that have emerged, as we heard from Ashley, part of it within the Democratic Party, we know many of you will have heard about the so-called Squad, which was four quite young women of color who were elected in the 2018 election and came in with explicitly socialist to social democratic politics, mostly not focused on international issues. Some of them have moved more towards international issues and foreign policy. In 2020, four more came in. They're known as they have another name. They're called the Speaking Truth to Power team, very similar to the Squad. So there's now within the Democratic Party this explicitly left-wing core within the Congress, which is very important in keeping the pressure on the mainstream of the party, partly because they have an energy that the mainstream of the party has not had for a decade or more. The work to elect Hillary Clinton, for example, people hated her. People within the party hated her as a candidate. She was a terrible candidate. Her policies, which were the same right-wing Democratic policies as before, but she couldn't even defend them in a decent way. Nobody wanted to mobilize for her. The new young people of color have brought a whole new level of energy, and the Biden White House has had to respond to that. It's why we see the influence of some of these movements, not all of them, but certainly the Black Lives Matter movement, the wide movement for climate justice, and the immigrant rights movement. We are seeing direct impact that is showing up in the policy level. The presence of explicit socialists within the government, within the Congress, has actually in some ways had less influence. They raise all the important issues and keep the wide range of social needs of the population front and center. But few of them are yet in a position where they're able to really engage with enough other members of Congress to get stuff passed. So that's a struggle within the left here. There's a tendency among many activists to push those extraordinary champions in Congress to take the furthest left position that they are prepared to take, to make the most left speeches they're willing to make. And one result of that is that they have less influence for building the kinds of congressional coalitions. So this question of what's the role of leftists within Congress, as opposed to what's the role of activists outside of Congress in keeping the pressure on, is a nuance that we don't have a lot of experience with in the US, and we're learning to struggle with it. On the right, and I will end with this because I think I want to make sure we have time for discussion and questions. I think that we are seeing certainly the rise of fascist movements within the US. We saw that certainly on January 6th of this year in the attack on the Capitol. It's the kind of thing that has led to coups d'etats in other countries, obviously. That extremist wing of the right wing, if you poll people, does not have enough support to win power. But what it does have is the lack of another right-wing component, another right wing that has the kind of energy and willingness to move in that direction. It has, crucially, the support of Trump. And right now, what you see is that the vast majority of Republican mainstream candidates, members of Congress, potential candidates, and political operatives at every level, including, crucially, state governments, even more important than Congress in some ways, around social justice issues. These are people who, whether they agree or not with the extremists, and particularly with the white supremacy centrality of that right wing, they will not break with it because they are afraid that that would lose them their votes and their ability to act as an agent of the ruling class. So the danger of that right wing, that fascist element within the Republican Party and that fascist element within the US population is a very, very serious threat, not because they can necessarily win votes based on that position, but particularly because the US, as you may know, is probably 3 or 4 years away, it's very close to being a majority non-white country, what some people are calling a majority minority country. It will be majority Black, Asian, Latinx, Native American. It will be amazing. And it will not be possible for the Republican Party alone to win elections. That's why they are focusing not on winning new voters, but on voter suppression to make sure that other voters cannot vote so that their minority position will win by illegal processes that no one can challenge. So I will leave us with that challenge, that we have an enormous challenge ahead of us in the United States. There is an incredible, vibrant movement, set of movements underway, explicitly left movements, explicitly socialist movements, faith-based movements, justice-based movements of all kinds. And they are having more influence on those in power than has been true for a very long time. But on the right, the same thing is happening with an extremist element having far more influence than their own membership would call for. And that's the challenge that lies ahead of us right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. We certainly have a lot of content and issues and interpretations to discuss. Now we have something like half an hour for questions and comments. The people who are in the panelist list, please, as I said before, use the raise hand function in the Zoom to ask for the floor. And the rest of the participants, please use the chat and we'll pick up your questions and comments as well. So, Chico.
Boa tarde. Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta sobre esse pacote do Biden, que é um pacote que quem estudou esse pacote viu que é um pacote de largo espectro, de forte impacto se realizado, né? Tanto em termos de infraestrutura, que parece que já foi aprovado no Congresso, a parcela a parte de infraestrutura, que é a parte menor, cerca de $1 trilhão, mas teria cerca de 2,5 trilhões de dólares, que seria justamente as medidas sociais e ambientais, e que, se aplicado, seria uma distribuição de renda razoável. Em termos ambiental, é uma mudança, por exemplo, da frota de combustível de petróleo para a parte elétrica, teria grandes impactos. Quais são, na opinião de vocês, quais são as perspectivas de aprovação, primeiro, dessa segunda parte do pacote e da sua real aplicação?
I don't know if you're asking one of us particularly, or if
Thank
you
you,
would like us
Chico.
both to answer. How shall we? Shall I jump in,
Anybody
or?
else? Sí.
Go ahead, Phyllis.
Okay, I think you're absolutely right. It's a huge amount of money, and it will have an enormous impact on the population. At the public level, there is massive support across party lines, across left and right, for all of these programs. There's programs involving access to childcare, access to healthcare, climate. Climate doesn't get as much as it needs to, but it's more than has ever been the case before. The disagreement is within the ruling class circles, and it goes less to the spending than where the money would come from. Unfortunately, there is not yet even political public demand for some of that money to come from cutting the military budget in half. There is one quite heroic Congresswoman, Barbara Lee from California, who was the only member of Congress in 2001 to vote against going to war in Afghanistan. She has proposed cutting the military budget by 10% this year, moving towards cutting it by half, which no one has ever proposed before, except no one within Congress. The money that is now being debated would come from raising taxes on the wealthiest Americans, and that's a huge high level, right? No one who makes less than $400,000 a year would see their taxes go up. So you can imagine that it's really the very ultra rich, but that's some thousands of people, and it would lead to an enormous amount. And raising the taxes on corporations. Those are the two main sources for how are we going to pay for these enormous projects. So that's where the opposition comes from. In the states, different members of Congress, both parties, oppose different components within these broad categories, mainly as a way of saying, I don't think we can spend that much money. We don't want to spend government money. We should be spending it in the private sector, et cetera, et cetera. But this notion of both the physical infrastructure and the social infrastructure, as well as what some are calling the democratic infrastructure, which is the two main voting rights bills that are pending. It's that set of 6 bills that are really underway here. So I think the issue is not how popular are those programs. They're massively popular. But the question will come, where's the money supposed to come from? And that's where you get into trouble. That's where they're having a hard time.
I agree with a lot of what Phyllis just said. I'll just chime in a couple of things. One, on the opposition, it is coming with a vengeance from Apple, ExxonMobil, Google. They have unleashed an army of their lobbyists and onto Congress to stop the tax increases. And these are the richest countries on the planet, the richest companies, not countries, on the planet. And so they are protecting enormous masses of profit from really a modest increase in taxation to pay for this social welfare spending. I do want to just qualify how the understanding of this social welfare spending, because if you think about it, the US has the most underdeveloped social welfare state of any of the advanced capitalist countries. I mean, the spending compared to most European countries is minuscule on social welfare spending. I mean, for God's sake, the Medicare doesn't even pay for dental coverage. So if you're an old person, you have to pay out of pocket or get private insurance to pay for your dental care. So this is making up for a huge underspending that is decades old. And so when you put it in that context, the increase is actually quite small by comparison to the need that people, working class people and people of color face in this country. And when you compare it to other sectors of the budget. So the physical infrastructure is a one-time shot spread out over 8 years of $1 trillion. But think about what Phyllis said. The US is spending nearly $750 billion annually on the military budget ad infinitum. And so when you put it in that context, even the $3.5 trillion in social welfare spending is totally tiny and should be much bigger. And I think that's got to be the posture of the left, which is, okay, this is good. We want so much more. We want a Green New Deal, because the spending on climate in these bills is a pittance. And it actually funds a lot of the problems that keep in place fossil capital and the polluting and warming system of the global hydrocarbon economy. And it's nowhere near what we've been fighting for a long time, like Medicare for all. I mean, this in many ways locks in place the problem of private health insurance, which is the main problem that most people face in accessing healthcare in the United States. So I just think our posture should be, yes, but we want much more. And the emphasis on the social movements and the socialist left is on the we want much more, because the only reason some of the good things are at the table, as Phil has said, is that people have been clamoring for it, from Occupy to the Red State teachers strikes to the Black Lives Matter uprising. So we need more of that, not inside the Beltway negotiations with the Biden administration over the terms of the small amount of money that we're going to get, because the energy has got to be in the streets and the workplaces to drive continuing radicalization of the progressive demands that we can make on the establishment.
Pierre, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. They were outstanding. And there's lots of things to explore further. I tend to be very careful with the word decline because maybe it's my age. In the past, we were so eager to see the decline. We were a bit catastrophist, okay? Not anymore. We're more serious than we were, but I'm still a little concerned. And I have two things for both of you. Ashley, the US capitalist system has many weaknesses. You don't need to insist. But, however, they still are the number one, or extremely powerful in the finance business, call it Wall Street, and extremely powerful in the techno business, call it Silicon Valley, to simplify. Even China will say we're years behind. We're catching, but we're years behind. So the question is, in the context of the decline, which I think is real, how do you cope with the fact that they still have dominance on the higher, commands post of capitalism worldwide? That's one. Second, Phyllis, the United States have been, before Afghanistan, have faced a sort of debacle in Iraq and Syria, right? How did they manage? They somehow left or diminished. They left behind an uncontrollable and apparently endless chaos and destruction. That's what they left. They make sure that no Iraq or Syria will be rebuilt. You can add to that Libya, whatever. Why? Because if they cannot control it, no one else will. And they will leave these awful sort of chaotic places to whoever. And sometimes, they will support Daesh. I would not be surprised that they would support Daesh in Afghanistan to weaken the Afghan. They've supported anyone in Iraq and Syria just to make sure that, the place is completely fucked up for years, if not decades. And so therefore, the departure of Afghanistan might not end the endless war, but change it as it has been changing it in Syria and Iraq. And therefore, we're not over with our problems. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just jump in first to address Pierre's question, and then I'll let you go, Phyllis. I think the key thing First, Pierre, I agree. There's been much exaggerations of the decline of U.S. imperialism all the way back to the 1970s, when people said, "Up, it's all over," after Vietnam, et cetera. And the reality is the U.S. maintained its position of global hegemony. And especially after the end of the Cold War, it was the unrivaled geopolitical and economic power on the planet. But I think its move and attempt to lock in that position rebounded on itself and by the catastrophe in Afghanistan and Iraq, the catastrophe mainly for the Afghan and Iraqi people, but the catastrophe also for U.S. imperialism, because they wanted to control the spigot of oil. If you control the spigot of oil, you control the world economy, and they lost that control pretty dramatically, so that the Middle East has more room for maneuver, and the various powers in the region and new powers like China and Russia have bigger agency in the region than ever before. So that was one thing that led to the relative decline. But I also think the neoliberal boom itself undermined the position of the United States, because you had the rise of China through this whole neoliberal period, especially since China's inclusion in the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, when suddenly it rocketed up to become the #1 manufacturing country in the world, and not just as petty commodity producers, not as export processing zones, but they're climbing up the value chain rapidly, so that they're now competing in the high-tech areas of industry and have enormous state backing in that project. So I think that there is no doubt a change in the balance of power in the world system, so that you have many players in the world economy and you don't have one simple, unrivaled global hegemon. So there are many rivalries that have emerged, the most important one being the US versus China. But the US is no doubt the world's dominant power. And everything that Biden is trying to do is to try and shore up that power. And his whole reorientation away from the war on terror to great power rivalry, which has been creeping into place from Obama to Trump to Biden. Biden is the most coherent of all of the administrations that has a plan to deal with this rivalry. And it's quite developed in terms of state funding for American industry, state protection of American industry, investment in high tech, controlling high tech capital and bringing it into a closer relationship with the United States so that it more serves US state interests, and imposing policies through the US network of alliances to curb the expansion of China's growth. So this is a new development in the system of a dominant power trying to guard its position of hegemony against a real rising challenger. The real strong points are the control of the dollar as the real reserve currency. That's what maintains US dominance, obviously Wall Street and high tech, but none of those are not free from being challenged. Increasingly, there are new currencies entering into the world market that could eventually challenge the dollar. They don't right now. There are new centers of finance and investment, including in China, and especially on high tech. China is rapidly rising up the value chain. Huawei and the kind of antagonism of the US state towards Huawei is just one indication, and there are many, many others. So I think this is the central inter-imperial rivalry. It's here to stay. It's a very dynamic situation, and both countries, the US and China, face enormous crises of their own. So the future is definitely uncertain. What's most important is that we build a left that has an awareness internationally of the importance of not taking a side between those rivals and siding with China against the US or the US against China, but building solidarity between the popular protests from below, from Hong Kong to the workers' movement in China to the workers' movement in the United States and in your own country, Quebec, Pierre. So I think that kind of international solidarity from below is key in this new epoch of inter-imperial rivalry.
Let's
Just-
take
Just quickly on the other question. I mean, of course, you're right, Pierre, that as I had said in my presentation, the war on terror is not ending as the US focuses more on China as its key strategic competitor. But it is changing. And the question, is always, whenever you're at war, even if it's in this so-called changing war on terror, one side doesn't get to make all the decisions. The other side has a say in what happens. So when there's an explosion of some sort, the US will respond in ways that could lead to a much greater direct engagement. I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon in Afghanistan in particular. We're already seeing collaboration between the US and the Taliban. We saw that over the last 2 years or more, where the US fought with the Taliban, US troops actually fought with the Taliban against ISIS. This whole so-called global war on terror is like, there's a carnival game in the US called whack-a-mole, where you have a hammer and something pops up and you smack it down, but another one pops up and you smack that down, like little animals coming up out of the earth. And in many ways, this global war on terror is like whack-a-mole. You can suppress one group and then suddenly another group emerges and you end up going back to the group that you just suppressed, and now you're going to arm them, give them money, support them, fight with them against this new group that for whatever reason you see as a bigger, more dangerous threat. So it's not over. And the problem is it engages a huge number of countries around the world in this struggle. And it's very visible. It's very much a component of people's lives in so much of the world, so that it simply can't be dismissed as this isn't any longer the strategic interest of US imperialism, which is now focused on China. It's still doing this. The military is still out there. And so I think we do have to keep up that struggle. It does make things difficult in one of the key ways in which this is not like Vietnam is that during Vietnam, there was an enormous global anti-war movement. In the United States, there was a huge anti-war movement for whom the main demand was US troops out now, get out. But within that movement, there was a core who supported the other side, who supported the North Vietnamese and the NLF. These days, and that was true throughout the 1980s as well in Central America, it was not just about ending US interventions in Central America, it was about, at that time, different. It was about supporting the Sandinistas, supporting the FMLN in El Salvador. In South Africa, it was not just stop supporting apartheid, it was we support the ANC. In most cases, we don't have that in the armed struggles that are underway around the world. Those that are fighting back militarily against US troops, against US planes, against US drones, against US bombs, are not the people that we would, as progressives, ally with. We don't get to choose who are the anti-imperialists in other countries, who our own governments may be at war with. So it's become more complicated. How do we fight for self-determination of all people, fight against US bombing anywhere, fight against US intervention anywhere, when we know that our partners are not the ones who are doing the military fighting, and those doing the military fighting are not the ones we support. It's become a more complicated struggle over these last 20 years. So all of that is still in play. That doesn't end with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Okay, in order to keep with the program, let's see if we can have more questions and comments before we have the closing comments by both Ashley and Phyllis. Sé Correa, you have the floor.
Yes. Vou falar em português para os tradutores. Eu queria agradecer muito a Phyllis e ao Ashley, porque a discussão está sendo muito interessante. Essa colocação em perspectiva simultânea do que é a dinâmica da luta de classes interna nos Estados Unidos e a competição eleitoral que se estabeleceu entre os democratas e o trumpismo, e o que é a disputa de hegemonia global que estabeleceu com a China. Essa interação entre a dinâmica interna e a dinâmica externa, da política externa, é bastante complexa e é vital para a compreensão do que está se passando no mundo hoje. Eu queria colocar duas questões. A primeira é a ideia que o Ashley levantou de uma transição para um novo regime de acumulação no capitalismo global. Eu acho que esse tema é importante porque isso não dependeria só dos Estados Unidos, dependeria também da Europa, dependeria da China. Há, de fato, me parece, elementos que apontam nisso, mas o que seriam os grandes traços desse novo regime de acumulação, não só pela política do Biden, mas pela dinâmica do capitalismo global? E a segunda questão é essa que a Phyllis estava tratando no final, da dificuldade de construção de um movimento de solidariedade interno dos Estados Unidos para uma nova agenda global que inclui não só a luta anti-imperialista, mas a luta por justiça social e a luta ambiental. Especificamente, o que seria o respaldo para uma política de transição energética ou climática, uma nova política climática global por parte desses novos movimentos, dos movimentos de justiça social que estão se desenvolvendo? Bom, difícil de entender.
I have a question here.
Okay. The question for Phyllis, vou falar em português para a tradução. Você falou da dificuldade a dificuldade dos movimentos de solidariedade internacional nos Estados Unidos se posicionarem hoje no contexto em que não há lutas anti-imperialistas com definições políticas como antes, como no Vietnã, ou na África do Sul ou na América Central. Quais seriam as dinâmicas que levariam a um movimento de solidariedade dos Estados Unidos no próximo período, da solidariedade interna dos movimentos sociais, em relação a temas como o combate das desigualdades no terreno internacional e a transição energética para combater as mudanças climáticas? That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Now I have a couple of questions from the chat. The first one is, well, thanks for the great presentations. And the question is, I was surprised to hear that Afghanistan had no strategic interest to the United States, but the war was launched basically for revenge only. It seems so ludicrous that I have a hard time believing that the United States would spend so much money just to work on its ego and reputations. Would you comment further on that? And the second question, I'm going to read in Spanish. It says, from Brazil. En Brasil elegimos en el 2018 a un representante de la extrema derecha. a un representante de la extrema derecha aliado con Trump, que sigue exactamente la cartilla del expresidente estadounidense. Negación, okay, negación de la pandemia, fomento del incumplimiento, de las políticas de aislamiento social, ataque a las instituciones democráticas, impugnación de proceso electoral, el año que viene tenemos elecciones en Brasil, donde Bolsonaro, tratará de reelegirse. A partir de la experiencia en Estados Unidos, ¿qué pueden presentar los analistas? Como elementos determinantes para evitar que Bolsonaro sea reelecto? Okay, now we don't have any more questions in the chat, and there's nobody asking for the floor. So if that's the case, last chance. Otherwise, we will have, as our panelists have already answered most of the questions, see if they have any final comments so we can close our meeting. So who goes first?
Doesn't matter.
Go ahead, Phyllis. Microphone.
Sorry. A couple of the quick answers to this last set of questions. On the issue of international solidarity movements, I think it's absolutely right that we need to do better than we have on building internationalism into all of our social movements in the United States. It's a very difficult struggle. We work a lot at my institute with a lot of social movements who represent undocumented people in the US, domestic workers, restaurant workers, others. And in all of those examples, the people who lead those movements, who work on setting the agendas for those movements, they are internationalists. They are people who have built their own political understanding in solidarity movements of various sorts. But it's very, very difficult when you're leading a movement of people who are desperate in whether it's economic questions, social questions. We see some change within the movement for Black Lives, which is the broader component of the Black Lives Matter mobilizations, who have taken up international struggles, particularly the question of Palestine, which has been a hallmark of progressive movements in the last several years in a very different way than was possible earlier, and that's been very important. But it's the hard part is that we have not been able to regularize the importance of internationalism as a necessary component of anyone or any organization who claims to be progressive has to be an internationalist. You know, we've done that in the US on certain issues. The question of race and the centrality of racism in the United States has set in motion long, and it took years, decades of struggle. This was not anything that was easy. Decades of struggle to get progressives to recognize the necessity of anti-racism as a central, not just a sideline, but a central component of everything they do. That has been a long struggle. We need to get to that same component around internationalism. It doesn't yet exist. In certain movements, in the movement around climate justice, for instance, there's a greater understanding of it because there's the understanding that climate doesn't recognize borders, right? The same with the movement around immigrant rights. The rights of immigrants are being violated by the United States, both inside its own territory and outside, all around the world. So it's easier there. In the women's movement, it's hard. What we see sometimes, like right now, in parts of the women's movement, is support for, condemnation of the US, not for how it withdrew from Afghanistan, but that it withdrew, that it did withdraw. Early on in the Afghan war, we saw support for that war from feminist organizations, women's organizations, including some on the left. And we have a lot of work to do to change that. I think some of that work is underway. Colleagues of mine at IPS who work on the military budget recently produced a terrific pamphlet aimed at the climate justice movement that was produced with activists from that movement that's called No Warming, No War, that analyzes and gives people tools to talk about the military budget and how the US military is one of the greatest producers of greenhouse gases in the whole world and what that means for the whole world. So it takes work. We can't simply assert we need to be internationalists. We have to help the activists and the leaders of all of those movements to figure out ways to make that a component of their ongoing work. That's what solidarity looks like. It's not just saying the words, it's helping people figure out how to make that part of their political organizing. On the Afghanistan question, certainly this was not only about vengeance. That's a personal thing. It used the issue of vengeance to mobilize support in order to produce an ideological level of support for the war in Afghanistan, for the war in Iraq, which would come later. So it was a preliminary preparatory war, if you will. And I think it's important to recognize that the US was prepared to spend billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, ultimately trillions of dollars, thousands of US lives, and more importantly, close to 100,000 Afghan lives in order to fight this war for no actual necessity as defined by imperialist rule. That is what happens when you are the world's power. You can do that. You can destroy another country, massacre so many people where there's no reason for it. And that's exactly what they did here. And then on the last point about Bolsonaro, I certainly know virtually nothing about the Brazilian electoral system. I would say one thing that was important to recognize. The US democratic system, as it's called, is very, very far from democratic. The short version of that is that our system of electing a president is not by the popular vote. The popular vote chooses within each state who electors from that state should vote for. And so if you have a system where the key states, you win by a tiny amount, that's good enough. But if you lose by just a tiny amount, that's enough to lose. I don't think the Brazilian system is like that. Trump lost by 7 million popular votes. So the way to do that, I think, is the same everywhere. It's expose of whose interests is he representing. He talks about the American people, but what does he do? We have to expose the lies. That's always the problem. The media is never going to do it for us. We have to do it for ourselves with our own independent media as well.
Thank you, Phyllis. Ashley?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all the people who organized this and Phyllis. I think it's been a wonderful exchange and discussion, and lots of questions that um, people, including me, don't have the answers to. And it's part of building a collective international movement to sort this out. So I want to thank everybody, especially the interpreters again. On the questions that were raised for me about the crisis of the neoliberal regime of accumulation, I think that we're in the early stages of certainly the American political establishment and the capitalist class in the United States trying to figure it out. They know what the problem is. That is the current regime of accumulation, of privatization, globalization, austerity measures, and tax cuts for corporations. That regime of accumulation is not raising the profit rates of U.S. capital and is, from the vantage point of the U.S. state, not bolstering the U.S. state in the world system. So they know that there's a problem, but like in the 1970s, where they identified that Keynesianism was failing in the 1970s to deal with the problem of stagflation, it took them 10 years to figure out what a new strategy would look like. It was first as neoliberalism started by Jimmy Carter with his process of deregulation, especially the busing industry. But then it was really accelerated under the twin evils of Thatcher and Reagan in England and the United States in the 1980s. So it took them a decade of trying to figure out what a new regime of accumulation would be like to restore profitability of capital and expand the system again. So I think that the Biden administration's shift away from simple neoliberalism to what I've been calling imperialist Keynesianism is a first iteration, and is a very tepid one, because I think there's still all sorts of neoliberal elements to what Biden is doing. So it's an incomplete break. And certainly when you put it on a global scale, the IMF, the World Bank, and the money lenders of imperialism's banks themselves, still are going to require structural adjustment as the economies in the global south go into crisis. So we may have a whole messy process of a long-term economic crisis of the system and no simple solution. And the jury's out, frankly, on whether any of Biden's weak Keynesian measures will accomplish their goals, which is encouraging the growth and profitability of American capitalism and bolstering the U.S. state's position in the world system against China. What I do think we're entering is in a whole epic of crises that are not going to be resolved by any government in any particular state, but are systemic in nature: a global economic long-term depression or global slump, the climate crisis, the pandemic, which is not ending anytime soon. In fact, it's just beginning in most parts of the global south, and the inter-imperial rivalries and interstate rivalries of a global and regional character, which are only going to intensify in this epoch of crisis. And that is going to create massive political polarization and instability in every state and in the world system. That's why the question about Bolsonaro in Brazil is extremely important. The comrades in Brazil will have much better ideas than I do about how to deal with it, with the challenge of Bolsonaro. But for drawing on the experience of Trump in the United States, we have to understand there is a real base for a far right in the United States, especially in the new middle classes, the small business owners, and certain sectors of the mid-level management of the high-tech industry in the United States. When you think about it, the average income of a Trump voter was around $100,000 a year. So it's that middle layer of the new middle class and petty bourgeoisie that are deranged by the crises in the world and don't have progressive instincts, but have reactionary authoritarian instincts and have a predisposition towards right-wing racist solutions. So there's a real basis to the development of a far right on a global scale, and Trump is one example of that. And I think we have to put square blame on who is at fault for opening the door to Trump and Trumpism in the United States. And that's squarely in the hands of the Democratic parties, whose support of the wars, of neoliberal economic policies, of austerity measures, open the door to these reactionary solutions to real problems, and especially that middle class people's lives. And especially the global free trade deals opened up a section of the working class who had suffered deindustrialization to also be attracted to these reactionary solutions of America First nationalism, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, the whole packet of horrific prejudices that Trump played upon. It opened up the floodgates for that as an appeal. That's why when I looked at the results of the 2020 election, I found them very disturbing, because Biden did win by 7 million votes, but Biden got 74 million votes. That's the most of any Republican Party candidate in US history. So there's a real basis for these reactionary solutions. And especially if Biden's administration doesn't deliver significant change that improves the conditions of the vast majority of people's lives, you could easily see a return to the far right. And that's why I have a much more critical take on what Biden is doing, because I think that its limitations are going to come back to haunt the administration and open up the door to the potential return of the right. The pandemic is running rife in our society. That's could weaken the economy. If the economy weakens, then there's a real opening for a return to the Republicans in the midterm election and a potential re-election of Trump in the 2024 election, because he's gone but not forgotten and could make a big time political comeback. And he's got a real stranglehold on the Republican Party. So it just underscores for me the importance of building an independent left that can challenge the corporate parties that run most countries in the world system, that has a much more radical set of demands for systemic reforms that will redress the real grievances in people's lives and emphasize the building of class and social movements that can raise those demands and force them on a reluctant capitalist class and their political representatives in power. So I think that's the most important thing, because that's the engine that pushes things in our direction. And the final point I'll make is something that Phyllis underscored, which is the difference in the world system compared to the 1960s, when you did have a rising international left that was embodied in national liberation struggles and global movements for systemic change. I think the left has to focus on rebuilding its forces on a global scale so that we can start building genuine solidarity in the common struggles against these systemic crises that we're all facing. So the moment of global solidarity is the urgent moral obligation of our whole generation of a new left in the world system. So I'm very happy to participate in this, and I hope in a small way this has contributed in building that international network of committed comrades to build a new international movement for a whole different society that puts people before profit.
Thanks, Ashley. Now Phyllis wants to make some finishing comments.
Just quickly, I think that I'm very grateful to the Global Dialogue folks for organizing this. This is a very good discussion with very good questions. We don't have answers for a lot of these questions, and that's why we need these kinds of events, these kinds of discussions. And I think one of the ironies of how we've all dealt with the pandemic is that we've learned to do these international Zoom meetings in a much more regular way. It's brought a lot more people into these discussions than used to be able to participate when it was all a question of who could manage to fly somewhere to participate in a conversation. So I'm grateful for all that. I'm particularly grateful to the organizers, and especially, of course, to the interpreters who work harder than all of us. Ashley, thank you, and Edgardo for chairing, and for everybody, thanks very much for joining us today.
Okay, thanks, Phyllis. So this brings to an end our webinar, seminar, whatever. I think it's been a very good discussion. So the next steps, I want to, well, first, Pierre is going to write a summary of the main ideas presented in the two presentations today, and he will send them both to Ashley and Phyllis so they can check them. And once we have this revised text, they will be published in the Global Dialogue webpage in the 4 languages. So we hope that this will be a contribution to this continued debates. I want to thank, of course, both Phyllis and Ashley for their presentations. All the people that have worked in organizing this panel, and of course, as everybody has highlighted, without the work of the interpreters, none of this would have been possible. So I insist on thanking you. And I would like to remind you that on the next 2 Thursdays, on the 9th and the 16th, we'll have the second and third part of the seminar. Next Thursday on US-China relations, and on the 16th on US, Latin America, in this context. So this isn't conceived as 3 different seminars, but as a whole seminar. So it's important to have a lot of continuity. And we hope that all this important framework that was presented today will really help in our interpretation and discussion of the issues that we'll be dealing with in the next 2 seminars. So thank you very much. And we managed to get oral discussions in less than 2 hours. We still have 4 minutes. So we can go and have coffee. So bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you for all.